Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw fur in pastels. Now this video is specifically going to focus on how to draw longer overlapping fur. Now my first process is to get some kind of base foundation in. For this project I decided just to use the pastel pencils purely so that I could show that you don't need all of the pastel supplies in order to create photorealistic drawings. Now my main priority at this base layer stage is to make sense of my reference photo. So here I'm just looking to map in my main lights and darks. I'm not focusing on trying to get the exact colour of the fur, it's purely where those highlights and shadows are. Now one thing that I do want to mention regarding the base layer is it's very important to make sure that you don't put your lighter layers down too soon. So although I say I'm mapping in my main lights and darks, it's more that I'm blocking in my lighter mid-tones because those highlights, those brightest values, we want to save those for our later layers. Now if those lighter layers were put down too soon, it means that we don't have anywhere to go with our additional layers. So if we start putting in our highlights and the layers underneath are too light, then those lighter details are not going to show up. So it's really important to make sure that this base foundation is dark enough. Now as I continue to layer here with my pastel pencils, you'll notice that I'm going to start to tidy up this layer. Now I don't want to jump straight into my details even though I've got some pastel on the paper. I want to be working with a little bit more of a softer base foundation. Now the reason I think that this is so important is because it helps to bring that softness to the details. As I now start to add in the indication of finer hairs, I'm able to create softness even just with one layer with my pastel pencils, and I believe that's because I've made sure that my base foundation doesn't have any harsh start and stop points. Now if you've seen many of my other videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I like to work in small sections. Now this is the case regardless of any animal or any subject that I'm drawing, but when the fur is a little bit more complex like this, I like to break it up into even smaller sections. I find that I work more effectively and efficiently, and I don't spend as much time staring at the reference photo hesitating trying to work out what part I should be drawing next. Now as I continue to work with my pastel pencils, I'm starting to now consider more about the pencil technique. Now I've got a video here on YouTube, it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur in pastels. I'll link that in the description below if it's of interest. But in that video I talk about pencil technique regarding things such as fur direction, fur thickness and fur length. Now these three factors are really important regardless of the fur texture that we're drawing. Now the reason being that fur direction is so important is because it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. So I want to be making sure that I've got that accurate because we could potentially end up adjusting the shape of the face just purely by not having the fur direction correct. Now when we're drawing longer overlapping fur like this, we're going to have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the fur direction because we've got more freedom of movement for each of those clumps of fur to move. However, that being said, it still is going to follow a general rule or shape of that face, so we still want to be making sure that we have got that as close and accurate to the reference photo as possible. Now this section of fur is a prime example of that. As I'm starting to map in this fur direction and really starting to exaggerate the curve, this is hinting at where the eye socket is underneath all of that fur. Now if I was to position this fur a little higher up or over to the right, then I'm going to drastically change the shape of the skull. Now obviously if this is a pet portrait and it doesn't resemble as much like that animal as it should, then that's going to become a real problem. I want to really make sure that I'm studying this as accurately as I can. Now the other thing that's really important is the layering process, and this is something that I'm going to continue to talk about throughout this video. You'll notice that I've left the top section of fur alone and I'm now working on the lower part. The reason being the top clumps of fur are overlapping the cheek area and underneath the eye. So in order for me to get this level of realism, I need to be making sure that I'm drawing the right layer at the right time. Now this is an important consideration no matter what animal it is that we're drawing. I want to be making sure that I am really emphasising at what point the fur is overlapping and sitting in front, maybe closer to the viewer, and what fur should be pushed back. Now with the overlapping fur that drapes over the eye, I want to be making sure that what is underneath that looks a little darker, so it's casting that shadow. That's going to help with more of that three-dimensional look of the portrait. But making sure that I am identifying which layer I should be drawing first can really also help to simplify the process. When we look at a reference photo like this, it would be very easy to jump into the top details, those lightest hairs. but I want to be making sure that I save that for my later layers. As I continue with my pencils here, you can see that I'm tidying up my darker values, and that's going to help to separate those clumps of fur a little more. I'm looking to emphasise the depth all through adjusting the contrast. I'm not looking to necessarily at this point add extra details. If I feel like my base layers underneath aren't dark enough, I'll go ahead and make those changes now, because it's going to have a bigger impact later on, and it means I won't be drawing over those details that I've potentially spent hours creating. And it's also about understanding from that reference photo at what point we should stop adding layers. Now here, when I start adding in more of my lighter pink highlights, I'm going to start to work on the ear. The reason being, I have the complete intention of coming back in and adding the final layers to all of this section that I've drawn so far, but some of those clumps of fur are overlapping the front of the ear. So going back to what I've just mentioned, I have to make sure that I've drawn what's behind it in first. So I'm going to leave this area on the left side alone, and I'm going to come back to that later. Now for the base layers of the ear, this is definitely one of the areas where it's quite confusing. There are many clumps of fur that are overlapping. Now regardless of the ear, it doesn't matter if it's a cat, a dog, whatever it may be, I always want to be drawing what is further away first, and in some cases that might be the skin. Now most of this ear is actually covered up with fur, but there is a little bit of a reddish tint that comes through in the centre, which I will reinforce later on. But if you're drawing a cat ear or a German Shepherd ear where they've got more of that upright but less fur ear texture, then that is going to show much more of the pinker values, so that's something that we do want to capture. And I would definitely recommend to draw that first before you start adding in the hairs. Where I'm starting to darken up the centre of the ear here, this is where I'm emphasising the skin, the darkest part, the bit of the centre of the ear that curves away. I want to be making sure that I've captured that shape first before I start adding in the fur detail. Now when I do start adding the detail, it's going to be a rinse and repeat process for the layering technique that I've used already. I want to be focusing on the layers that are closest to the skin and building up from there. And also, just as before, I'm also focusing on the fur direction. Now the fur length, this is going to be one of those considerations where we have to vary it depending on the section of fur that we're drawing. So the fur at the top of the ear is shorter. As it gets to the base of the ear, it gets longer, and then it starts to overlap the top section of the face. So all of this we need to be making sure that we are varying depending on that one section of the reference photo. Now the length of the pencil strokes is determined by how long the pencil's in contact with the paper for, but it's also about how much pressure is applied, because I don't want to be applying the same pressure at the beginning and end of the pencil stroke to what I would be doing in the centre, because that line that we're creating, that detail, is going to potentially look longer because it hasn't been faded in or faded out. So this is something that I do emphasise in the step-by-step real-time tutorials. I want to be making sure that I have captured the softness of that fur, and that also does come with the pressure that's applied. Now another factor to consider when judging how much pressure to apply is how thick the pencil stroke should be. Now for the most part here, I'm actually working with thicker details than I am my finer details. Now I want to be making sure that I've captured that if the fur is more clumped together. So if I want to create a thicker pencil stroke, I'm going to be applying a little bit more pressure. If I want to create a clump of fur, I will do a combination of pencil strokes in that one area. And I want to be making sure as well that I'm using the right point on the pencil. Very rarely do I use a very sharp point. I want to be working with a little bit more of a blunter point to help with the different texture, depending on what that is that I'm drawing. Now when drawing realistic fur, there are many things to consider, just a few of those that I've mentioned in this video. So to make sure that I cover those as thoroughly as I can, my real-time step-by-step tutorials are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so there are no sections sped up or cut out, and I'm able to explain every single process while I'm doing it. It really helps to make even the most complex fur textures or complex subjects easier to tackle. And if this tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons are of interest, I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. Now where I'm at this stage, we could easily call this done. I've got enough pastel on the paper, it certainly is indicated at realistic fur, and it'd be very tempting to call it finished too soon. But as I continue to put more of my lighter values in and enhancing the contrast, you can really see that this starts to add loads more depth. This is the stage where we can add just a few extra minutes but make a real difference to the final portrait. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.